Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Now, since my last upfront videos, I've had one or two requests from some of you, both online and offline, as to whether I can do a armoured engagement. So I'm very happy to oblige because what I'm going to do is leave aside infantry for the moment and concentrate on a purely armoured engagement. I've decided I'll stay in the sunny Pacific and Far East, and so, having done a bit of reading around the subject, I've decided to pick on a battle that took place during the US conquest of Saipan in 1944. Now, there were actually a couple of armoured engagements here, very unusual for the Pacific War, in that the Japanese actually turned up with a fair amount of armour. Of course, the engagements were brief, brutal, and showed up the enormous disparity between the quality of US tanks and their Japanese opposite numbers, but also in the almost complete lack of sensible Japanese armor tactics when compared to their US counterparts. So it makes for an interesting scenario. Very often, when you focus on pure tank battles, people will think of the Eastern Front. That's the obvious one. With regard to the war in the Pacific and the Far East, you do have the Japanese-Soviet spat in 1939 up in Nomonhan, where the foretaste of the future, really, the Japanese army, including its armor units, were decisively crushed by their Soviet opponents. But I wanted something a bit smaller scale than that, and one of the handful of unsuccessful Japanese counterattacks on Saipan seemed a very good example to enable me to show you how armor combat works in this game. Now, Upfront has very, very detailed rules for integrating armour and infantry, because of course infantry combat is the bread and butter of Upfront, and the armoured vehicles are really incidental to that. They turn up as penny packet reinforcements. But the game can accommodate pure armour combat. So, as I say, to keep things simple, although infantry were always present, even during the major tank battles of the Pacific War, I've decided to leave them out of this and just focus on tank versus tank. So for this particular scenario, I'm going to use the jungle rules to a limited extent. As with my previous scenario where the British were trying to break through a Japanese roadblock, we're dealing with the environs near Garapan in Saipan. So you have some urban environment. You also have some jungle. So as far as the jungle rules go, I'm just going to apply the modifier to shooting for the tangled jungle growth. But otherwise, I'm going to leave it. Buildings will be treated as buildings to represent the outskirts of Garapan. There will be open spaces for beaches, roads, and so forth. And we will see how we get on. I propose to play the Japanese side as they operated historically. They're basically going to hurl themselves at the Americans in a headlong rush to push them back into the sea. I will play the US side a bit more sensibly and historically, and hope that with the use of historical tactics, we can get a bit of a story going while I show you how the game works. Now, just to introduce you to the specifics of armoured vehicles, because they're a little different to the infantry cards. They come with their own built-in ordnance. The boxed figure represents anti-armour capability. The unboxed number is the more conventional rating that can be used against tanks if you're attacking exposed crew or the morale of the crew, or indeed infantry accompanying the tank, or who are turning up elsewhere in the other player's squad. If it's helpful, think of them as the difference between armor-piercing ordnance and high-explosive ordnance. Tanks have an overrun rating for when they enter close combat against infantry. We won't be worrying about that in this scenario. That's the crew exposed rating. That is common to all tanks. That's the level that an attacker has to hit or better, so a 9 or more when you're firing, in order to kill a member of the crew and force an armoured vehicle to button up. So that's the crew exposed side, and that's the buttoned up side. Vehicles can voluntarily button up. They can also be forced to button up by enemy fire. Vehicles are susceptible to bogging down in rough terrain. Their weapons can break. That's a familiar one from the infantry cards. You can suffer malfunctions. Again, with the built-in ordnance, most armoured vehicles have machine gun force points, and they also have to-hit ratings. So that's the range of random number draws you need to pull to secure a hit, depending on how far away your target is. There's a load of other factors that come in when you're targeting vehicles, and I'll try to explain those as we get on with the game. Tank crews have morale, just like every other unit. And this is the armour rating for the vehicle. So armour is assumed to be front armour, and of course flank armour is noticeably weaker. These numbers represent the threshold that a penetrating hit has to score to either I, immobilize, S, stun, or K, kill the target. So the Type 97, the improved version, the Shinhoto Chiha, has pretty weak flank armour and not too bad front armour. But when you compare it to its counterpart and nemesis, the M4 Sherman with the 75mm gun, look at that. The US tank is by comparison a bit of a beast and takes a lot more killing. Now, unlike the smaller tank engagements of Western Europe vis-a-vis the Eastern Front, there could be a lot of stalk and kill tactics going on. I think Kursk, when you look at the Eastern Front, is a bit closer to a massive armoured brawl at close quarters. And that's really what I'm going for in this scenario. The tank battles on Saipan were close affairs. The Japanese actually wanted to get close to maximize the effectiveness of their vehicles and their weaponry. Unfortunately, the process of getting themselves close was also what resulted in their horrendous losses. So this is going to be a bit of a brawl at close quarters, which is why I've imposed a time limit of only 2 decks on this game. And I've started everyone off at relative range 2 to each other. So this is going to be short, sharp, and extremely nasty. The Japanese are the attackers, so I'm giving them the initiative. And let's see how they get on. Initial placement of terrain, the Japanese have nothing useful in their hands, so they're just going to hold off. The United States has nothing useful either, because I'm using that as a scenario-defined cower card. So everyone's in open ground, which is fair enough. I imagine the Japanese would have chosen their deployment area undercover, but once the US vehicles approach across a patch of clear ground, they're just going to go for it, as they did historically. But no one's going to move just yet. Instead, there's going to be some shooting. Now, with ordnance, you don't have to match the firepower requirement to fire the card as you do with conventional infantry weapons or an armoured vehicle's machine guns. If you're firing your main gun, you can play any firing card, and that is sufficient. So the Japanese Type 97 is going to try and score an early win by at least damaging, maybe even knocking out the US Sherman. So they're at relative range 2, which means the Japanese have to draw a random number in a 0, a 1, or a 2 to score a hit. Now, neither the shooting unit nor the target is moving, so the random number can be either red or black, it doesn't matter. So they load their gun, fire, boom, it's a miss. It's outside the number range. However, because they've targeted the US tank, oh, I forgot, I should have added that under the jungle rules, it would have had to have been a 0-1 because of the poor visibility. But for a future turn, because they've fired at the Sherman, they have acquired it as a target, which means that the Sherman's group marker is flipped as a reminder that if the Chi-Ha fires at them again in subsequent turns, then they will get a benefit to their to-hit frequency draw, effectively nullifying the effect of the light jungle. So it's a pity for the Japanese that that was a miss, and they have alerted the US forces to their presence, which is also unfortunate, but there we go. Now, having sighted them, the US Marines are going to be incredibly quick off the draw. Rather than throwing off their aim by getting underway, they're going to cash in on the fact that they have all these gorgeous firing cards, and each US armoured vehicle is going to target its opposite number. Ouch. So let's start with the Sherman, because I imagine they're anxious to deal with the Japanese who have just fired at them. So at relative range 2, they draw 0-2. Slightly clumsier effort, I think. Oh no, actually not. So reduced for jungle, they need a 0-1. Again, neither of them's moving. And the US miss too. But like their Japanese counterparts, they have now acquired their target and are tracking it. Let's move on to the M3 and see whether it can draw bead on the Type 95. Same number range to hit. Nope, they've missed as well, but they have acquired the target. And finally, the Greyhound reconnaissance car is going to fire at the Type 97, the tankette. Oh gosh, normally that's good, but this time it means the shot was way, way off. They're going to have to work on that one. So a storm of fire in response to the initial Japanese shot, but nothing concrete really. Now, examining their hands, the Japanese still only have one firing card, so it makes most sense for the upgunned Chi-Ha to try another shot against the US. Incidentally, when you're in a big, conspicuous armoured vehicle, cover cards, the reaction card that infantry can play, have no effect. So, you know, you're a target in plain sight. You're not going anywhere. So this time the Japanese benefit from being able to use the 0-2 number range because of their target acquisition. They fire and they miss. I think their shots are getting closer. Closer compared to last time, but they still haven't hit. Nail-biting moment for them. Meanwhile, the US. They have no firing cards this turn, but they feel quite confident because of their thicker armour. So what they are going to do is order all 3 of their vehicles forward. Even though this is very much a Japanese ambush, they are going to meet it by going straight for it. So the whole US line is advancing. And of course this has consequences because everybody's aim has now been thrown off. So all these target acquisitions are now gone because the US are roaring forward. And that is it. They will draw their cards. The Japanese have a bit of a terrible hand at the moment. That open ground is pretty useless to them, and they'll take a chance on throwing away a Rally 2 card. No, they won't. That if I use it as light jungle in the game, is good cover, but it carries the risk of a vehicle bogging down. Far better for them to discard that, or discard both of them on the US forces. So they're going to discard the open ground on the Greyhound, which will accept it because one spot's as good as the next, and if they've braked their movement, their shooting will be better. They're going to play the light jungle on the Sherman in the hopes of bogging it down. Now the Sherman is not going to take that risk and play ball. It's perfectly happy out in the open, but its driver is forced to alter his course to avoid that very dense clump of undergrowth. So the US has to return to its previous relative range. So the Japanese are keeping them at arm's length. And having done that little bit of passive mischief, they'll draw some fresh cards. Okay, things are not quite going how the US wanted. They do have some firing cards which they really want to use. But first, they're going to try and get their Sherman back on course. So having skirted the trees, he's going to roar forwards again. While the M8 and the M3 provide covering fire. So we'll do the M8 first, targeting the Type 97. Relative range is 3. So allowing for the jungle, they need to draw 0 to 2 on their number range. And they have hit. Now when you score a hit, you add your draw to your boxed ordnance rating. So in the case of the M8, that is 2 plus 0. And it strikes the front armour of the Type 97 for a stun result. Nope, I lie. You add your relative range. Apologies for that. So your relative range gets added, which is 3 plus 2 for a 5. Which means that the vehicle is killed. So they have knocked out the Japanese light tank. The M3, meanwhile, lining up on the Type 95. It's moving and allowing for the jungle. They need to draw 0 to 2. Now, because they're moving, they can only use the random number if it's a black one. A red one will be a miss. And that is a miss anyway. But they have acquired the target again. Not a bad turn for the US. They've knocked out the weakest of the Japanese armoured vehicles. And they are forging ahead. The Japanese are still looking very unhealthy. They're going to discard again the weakest of their rally cards along with the woods card. Going to see if they can confuse that Sherman with another clump of trees. And again, the US player very sensibly decides he does not need to go in there. Now the Japanese have been quite clever because by forcing the tank, I mean it was his decision, but by forcing him to turn away, he's now moving laterally, which means that if he is hit while performing that movement, it's going to be against his flank rather than his front armour. And as we've seen from the numbers, that can make a difference. Back to the United States. Not such good options anymore, it would seem. Yes, actually, there's an awful lot they can't do, really. So what they're going to do is they're going to take that scenario-defined cower card and a couple of these, I'd say one of those not so helpful smoke cards, because they've got a lot of them. And to avoid any further Japanese shenanigans, they're going to come to a halt. Get their bearings, really. Now, coming to a halt is significant because it loses the M3, its target acquisition. But the US does need some more options, and by options I mean firing cards. And that was very neatly timed because the Japanese were more than ready to do more terrain discarding, including the minefield they happen to have to hand, but they desperately need options too. And so they've got no choice but to just put those in the discard pile because none of the US units is moving. They'll draw a card or two. Same problem on the US side. As I said before, concealed cards, even if you could use them, are no good when you're a tank. So really, they're just going to ditch two of those. The Japanese acquired a firing card last turn. Good news for them because they need to try and get the upper hand. Now they have an interesting choice because the Sherman is further back. It's going to be a harder shot to hit it. These two lighter US units are within easier range. But the question for the Japanese is, do they want to try and knock off weaker US units? Or do they want to try and tear the heart out of their formation by going for the Sherman? I think with my Japanese hat on, metaphorically, I would regard the Sherman as the worthiest opponent. So as the commander of the Chiha, I would make my shot at the Sherman. So relative range of 2 and allowing for jungle, I have to do 0 to 1. And it's a hit. We're not moving, so my ordnance rating is 2, plus my plus the relative range 4. We have immobilized them. Now that is bad news for the US tank. Our shot has busted one of its tracks. A vehicle cannot recover from immobilization within the scope of a scenario, and the effect it has is that whenever you're fired at subsequently, the armor test is made against your flank. So that is a minor triumph for the Japanese. Knocking the thing out would have been infinitely better, but in their current state, I think they'll happily settle for an immobilization. The US, for their part, is still frantically hoping for good cards. They are going to discard the cower and smoke cards because really they can't do anything. Ooh, yes. I forgot to give the Japanese a target acquisition because they're now drawn a bead on that Sherman. So the Sherman has been wounded, but it's still a dangerous opponent. It may be immobilized, but it can still fire. The commander of that Chiha is already ramming another shell into the breach or getting someone else to do it. Hard to tell who's doing what in those incredibly cramped turrets. He is going to fire again while the going is good. So the target acquisition negates the effect of jungle, so he can hit on a draw of 0 to 2. And he gets a 2. Goodness. So another hit. It is now it's hit on the flank now because it's immobilized. So a total of 4. Oh my goodness. The Type 97 has just killed the Sherman. That was an absolutely splendidly executed attack on the part of the Japanese. Very fortunate, I must say. So that Japanese tank got off 2 shots before the Sherman was able to properly react. Very fine shooting. Doubt the other US tanks are going to let them get away with it, though, and I would be right. The M3, which is now the most powerful unit in play on the US side, is going to try and remove the threat posed by the Chiha by firing at it in turn. I'll just do the target acquisition now to get that done. So relative range of 3, allowing for jungle, they need a 0 to 2. Ooh, their ordnance has malfunctioned. That's not good news. Let me just find a... So the unfortunate Stuart tank loses its target acquisition and becomes graced with one of these unwanted counters. It's going to have to try and fix its main gun. That is very, very unlucky. The Japanese side, by virtue or whatever you'd call it of their cards, has to lapse into inactivity. They can't discard the stream on the US forces, which is really annoying, but neither of them are moving. So they're going to take a chance and get rid of a rally card, but also have a Japanese sniper try and force that one to keep its head down or to button up. So the sniper makes his draw. A 5, that's a KIA. Oh my goodness. So things are going from bad to worse for the US vehicle. It's forced to button up, it's been pinned, and it suffered a commander killed result. That's bad. Regardless of what it is, if a vehicle suffers 3 personnel killed results, that effectively is a kill. It's out of the game. So the Greyhound crew have been forced to keep their heads down by a Japanese sniper. Very thematic, I must say. And the Japanese draw their cards. They are very happy about this. Now it cannot react on the US turn to the sniper, so that just goes away. But what it can do is begin to try rallying itself. Now, any pinned open-topped vehicle can rally if it gets a cumulative 3 rally points, or a rally all card, or a hero card even. So the US are going to start with a rally 2 card to try getting the crew of that thing back underway. Meanwhile, the poor Stuart is going to try and repair its main gun. And they do it. Must have just been a quick jam or something, but anyway, they freed the breach mechanism or whatever was causing the trouble. And they will be ready to go next turn, they hope. Question is, are the Japanese going to allow them a next turn? Now, so far, the Japanese have been holding back, but I think now they sense their moment is coming. The Type 95 is going to lead a cautious charge to try and get itself close. I'm not sure how much you can do a cautious charge in a tank, but there we go. And because that is a movement card, it doesn't count against the Japanese discard limit. So they're also going to gleefully chuck some wire down on the Stuart just to make its life absolutely miserable. The US are in a bit of an awful position, really. they get some satisfaction in being able to rally the crew of the Greyhound. So despite their losses, they are back in the fight. But they have no movement cards, so they can't sort out whatever's discomforting the Stuart. We'll call it Japanese shelling from the higher ground inland. Guns up on the hills being redirected onto this new threat. The Japanese counterattack so far is developing far more advantageously than such things did historically. Bit of a surprise, really. Japanese are going to capitalize on their success and their heavy tank, as much as you can call a Chiha heavy tank. But then I'm an optimist. Chiha is going to drive forward. And again, they can actually discard a card because it's a movement card. It plays to the Japanese national strength. Movements don't count against discards. But do they want to just discard these? Maybe they want to keep them to mess up the US advance even further. Might be worth it. They have the upper hand at the moment. The US, in the meantime, are getting rather desperate. They've got nothing that they can play. At least nothing useful. However, they can take a turn at messing the Japanese up with a terrain discard. So to begin with, they chuck some wire on the Type 97. Must have run into its own bombardment. So it's caught up short by that. And then they throw a gully at the Type 95. Call it a shell crater or a trench, what have you. Anyway, the commander of that tank wants absolutely no part of that, because if he goes into it, he runs the risk of bogging down. So he veers off to go around it, very kindly exposing his flank to the US. Now, despite the penalties involved, Type 97's commander decides it's worth a shot at the Stuart, so he's going to take it. They're at relative range 4, so it's virtually knife fighting distance for a tank. The effects of wire, they pretty much negate each other. So really it's just the effect of the jungle. Neither tank is moving, so it's a 0 to 3 for him to hit. And it's a hit. So the relative range plus the effect number yields a total of 6, which astonishingly kills the Stuart. So another US vehicle has been knocked out. Oh, I should have taken into account the... Oh, no, I had. So in this incredible turnaround from what I was expecting, the US force is very much on the run. Now, that little Japanese victory, they would only draw their cards after this. That takes care of over 50% of the US force. So the survivor, the M8, would withdraw. It's seen enough that the unit is effectively broken. Now, historically, this would be nothing more than a very isolated Japanese success. An incredible one, to be sure. But I hope that's given you a flavour for how armour battles work in Upfront. They can be incredibly luck dependent. Armour combat is very fast and furious in this game, and tanks can die scarily quickly. But I find that quite realistic, because in a tank-on-tank battle there are very often no second chances. And this kind of cut and thrust is very much in keeping with the sort of thing you would expect as an armored unit. So presumably in this case, the US forces came trundling up the road, not expecting that much trouble, and unfortunately they got it. I doubt the two Japanese vehicles here would last very long. Certainly, there'd be more U.S. tanks down the road, more than willing to avenge their comrades. But even if their lives are measured in seconds after this, they can briefly glory in having struck a blow for the Empire and the Emperor until Nemesis catches up with them. At any rate, yes. So of course, if you play combined armour and infantry forces, the games do go on quite a bit longer. Infantry, as you've seen, take a great deal more rooting out and killing in this game, which is again realistic. But in a straight tank on tank battle, the results can be, I'd say, almost terrifyingly fast. But as I say, I hope this has been useful, and I hope you've enjoyed following this one. If you want to see more scenarios, perhaps one where we have integration of armor and infantry on both sides, perhaps, or maybe even the use of infantry guns and heavier artillery, more use of open topped vehicles, anything you'd like to see, please let me know. I also welcome tactical suggestions, although maybe I don't need them. My headlong suicidal counterattack by the Japanese proved not so suicidal after all. But that, I think, was very much luck of the cards, if I'm honest. The Japanese were fortunate to get the drop on the Americans on this occasion. No doubt in a future such battle, the US would probably turn the tables fairly easily. But I'll leave you there. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope you, wherever you are, if you have this game, you are thoroughly enjoying Upfront. Bye.